Welcome again to this Autumn Wednesday, the first of four sessions that we've got on Wednesday lunchtimes coming up. An opportunity to hear from a guest speaker on some aspect of the life of the Spirit and how it relates to the church today. And I'm really thrilled that John Maiden from the Open University, head of the Department of Religious Studies, is with us. I first came across his work because he's the co-editor of a book called, I can see it here, Transatlantic Charismatic Renewal 1950 to 2000. But fascinatingly, he has a whole book that he has researched and written on the history of charismatic renewal, which is being published by Oxford University Press in January. So we are among the first, I think, to be hearing publicly about this. So John, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And shall we check that we can hear you okay?
Can you hear me okay?
I can, and other people as well can as well. So we're going to chat for half an hour or so, something like that, and then open up to other contributions and discussion more widely. So if there is something that you would like to ask, do feel free to put that in the chat initially, and we will open things up a little bit later. And then by around 1:45, 1:50, something like that, we will move into a time of prayer. So that's the agenda for our time together, for so that you know what we're up to. So, John, the book is called The Age of the Spirit, and you talk about the Anglo world. Tell us about how you came to this topic, and why you think it matters and is worthy of a book-length treatment in this way.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to come speak to you. I finished writing the book and submitted it about 2 months ago, so I hopefully can remember things that are in it. But you are the first group of people I've had a chance to talk to about it, albeit it's a few months until it will be available. I suppose the historians arrive at their topics across quite kind of tangled pathways. Mine, I suppose, is a combination of personal biography and of a professional context as well. Personally, I experienced, I suppose, two sides of Christianity growing up. I grew up in quite a conservative evangelical church, where I suppose a lot of the Christians around me were quite suspicious of charismatics. And I can remember being in church, and if someone raised their arms during worship, there would be a kind of awkwardness that you would, as a young person, I would kind of sense it across the congregation. And, everyone would kind of look at their feet slightly awkwardly. So there was that background, and then I suppose in my teens and early 20s, I began to attend a charismatic church. An independent church. It had formerly been a Brethren assembly. And I suppose this opened me to a kind of a very different expression of Christianity, one which in some ways I found compelling, but also raised questions for me as well. And also I just became very interested at that point in, I suppose, the kind of the subculture of charismatic Christianity, which that church was a part of, and it was a global subculture. It was people were listening to music and speakers from all over the world in that church, from places like Toronto, Sydney, California, London, and all over. So I suppose I became quite interested in the culture of charismatic Christianity. So my background is one of this interesting dynamic, I think, of growing up in a background that was suspicious of charismatics, but also one, my own kind of journey, I suppose, of growing curiosity about charismatic Christianity. And then there was the professional context as well. I finished my PhD in 2008. And it was looking at conservative evangelicalism in the Church of England in the early 20th century, and had nothing really to do with charismatics. But I was asked at the end of that to write a piece for the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography on David Watson. And David Watson, you've possibly heard of him, a very well-known Anglican cleric. He ended up in St. Michael the Belfry in York, a flourishing church there. And when it came to researching that piece on Watson, it really kind of, it occurred to me there was very little literature, scholarly literature on charismatic Christianity in this country. And there were all kinds of sources written from within the charismatic community, some very helpful. But there was not a great deal of scholarly literature. And I suppose I noticed a gap there. And because it seemed very strange that a movement that has become so significant within the churches should not have a kind of critical history written around it. So in 2014, I started to research this history. It was around the same time that some archives of some of the key leaders, I suppose, in the early charismatic renewal were becoming available. So I spent some time in the Michael Harper papers. I was able to interview Jan Harper as well as part of the research. I spent some time in the Dennis Bennett papers. You may have heard of Dennis Bennett over in Virginia, in the United States, the David Duplessis archive in Pasadena. And these are wonderful archives. We're all opening up at the same time. And I really just kind of immersed myself in that material for a number of years. And it became clear to me very quickly that if I was going to write a history of this movement, it would need to be a global history. Because this was self-consciously and in a self-aware way, a global movement, a transnational movement, and one that particularly mapped onto the Anglo world countries, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, British Isles, but also, and this is something that I try to capture in the book, from its very beginnings, and we can talk about when does the charismatic renewal begin. That's a really interesting question. But in its origins and in its emergence and in its development, always part of this kind of global tapestry of charismatic, Pentecostal and holiness movements. And that's something that I try to explore in the book. And the question at the heart of the book, Christopher, this is quite a long answer to your question. I hope that's okay. Do interrupt if you need to.
No, I will.
The question at the heart of the book, in a nutshell, is, I suppose I'm asking how a movement that is so kind of almost mainstream, in some ways normative in so many churches, including mainline churches now, in this country and other countries, moved from the periphery in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s to becoming part of the mainstream. That's the question at the heart of the book, and that's the question I'm trying to answer. I'm looking at the period between 1945 and 1980, but those are not firm bookends, because I really am interested in the prehistory of the charismatic renewal. So the early chapters of the book, I'm looking at kind of antecedents, I suppose, of charismatic spirituality in the Keswick movement, in the Casillo Catholic movement, within various radical forms of Pentecostalism, within the healing movement, particularly within Anglicanism and Episcopalianism. So I am interested in the prehistory, so I go way earlier than 1945. And I'm also interested in the legacies of the movement. How has it shaped global Christianity today? What are the kinds of questions that it's asking to global Christians today? And where I suppose I finish is that if you want to understand global Christianity as it is now, you need to understand charismatic Christianity. You need to understand something of history. And that's what the book is about.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I mean, I'm fascinated by this, and I guess other people are, because they've joined the call. I mean, I'm very fortunate to have seen an advance copy, and I was fascinated that you begin with the Fountain Trust conference at Guildford Cathedral in 1971 as a particular event to reflect on, and then kind of use as a launch pad. And of course, for us at Resource, our kind of organizational history is previously as Anglican Renewal Ministries, which was a successor organization to the Fountain Trust that put on that conference in 1971. So why did you choose that? I mean, you've got a nice photo of it, but I'm sure that wasn't the only reason. Why was that a good launch pad for the book as a whole?
Well, there are a lot of nice photos of the 1971 Guildford conference. And actually, there are so many photos. I mean, there's a Fountain Trust album of photos that sits with the Elim College in Malden now. And there are so many photos there of that conference. It's obvious that the organisers believed that something significant was happening, believed that this was a significant moment for the renewal. And after the Guildford Conference in 1971, they describe it as a kind of coming of age of the charismatic renewal of the church. It's in the newest cathedral, Anglican cathedral in the southeast of England, the first to be built there since the Reformation. It's a cathedral that throughout the cathedral, it's clear that the building is dedicated to the Holy Spirit. And so it seemed like an appropriate place for the organisers to organise this conference. And the conference itself does speak a lot to the identity and the shape of the charismatic renewal in the UK at that time. If you look at the list of people who attend, it's an incredibly diverse group of people. Yeah, the majority are Anglicans, but there are many Catholics in attendance. One of the Catholics, one of the organisers, an American called Bob Bulkham, was a Catholic layman who had arrived in the UK to I suppose help to lead the Catholic renewal here. He was one of the organisers. For a number of Anglican evangelicals, Guildford was really eye-opening. You know, a number, and I think David Watson was amongst them, to meet these Catholic charismatics who knew their Bibles well, who loved Scripture, who very clearly, as far as they could see, loved Jesus Christ. And I suppose the conference appeared to be breaking down some of those historic antagonisms between both Protestant and Catholic, and evangelical and Anglo-Catholic within the Church of England. But also it was diverse. You know, there are other mainline churches in attendance, independent charismatics and Pentecostals in attendance. People like Arthur Wallace was one of the speakers. It was a very diverse crowd. And then you have a kind of more establishment figures as well from within Methodism and Anglicanism. So a very, very diverse crowd of people. And I think that theme of unity, that theme of unity in the Spirit, and also I think the flip side of that theme of reconciliation, within the power of the Spirit, very evident at Guildford. And I think one of the key characteristics actually of charismatic renewal within the Anglo world at that time. But it was also the organisers decided to call it the first international conference of the Fountain Trust. And that too says a lot about I suppose about the eschatology of the movement, actually, because the organisers of the Fountain Trust and of similar charismatic organisations in other countries had a sense that something was happening at that moment in the history of the world, that was something along the lines of a new Pentecost. Very often the term latter rain was used to describe what was happening at that moment, and not just by Pentecostals. You know, Arthur Wallace was another evangelical who used the term. Michael Harper, one of the key organisers of the Fountain Trust, wouldn't necessarily use the term explicitly, but he, in some of his language, was remarkably close. There was this idea of a new Pentecost. There was this idea that of a resurgent church, a revival within the church that was to precede the coming of Jesus Christ. Now, eschatology, that thinking about what happens at the end and what God is doing in the earth, is by its very nature global. And I think that contributes to this kind of global, cosmopolitan mentality of these charismatics. There were people at this conference from all over Europe, from France, from Norway, from Denmark. There were people there from all over the world. You know, there were some of the founders of the equivalent of the Fountain Trust in Australia and New Zealand were both at the Guildford conference. Ray Muller and I forget the founder of the Temple Trust, Alan Langstaff, were there. And they go back and they found very similar organisations in New Zealand and Australia. There were South Africans there. There were multiple speakers and musicians from America there. So this was an international conference as well. It was diverse in its churchmanship, and it was diverse in the international attendance of people that were at it. And there's this real sense there. The term that I come to over and over again in the book to try and make sense of the charismatic renewal is imagination. And by imagination, I don't mean imagined. I don't mean not real. You know, I'm not a theologian. Those kinds of questions are way above my pay grade as a humble historian. But I mean the way in which people imagine the world around them, make sense of the world around them. And you know, this was a movement. It lacked hierarchies. It lacked really organizational structures. It was based really around the movement of tapes and cassettes and records, of magazines like Renewal and New Wine and New Covenant. And it was taking place in prayer groups, in people's front rooms, in church halls, in manses, in all kinds of kind of unexpected places within the normal, outside of the normal boundaries of the church building still. And what held it together was this sense of imagination. And there was, I suppose there were three dimensions to the charismatic imagination in the early 1970s. Firstly, it was a deeply biblical movement. It was an imagination that was grounded in the Book of Acts. Michael Harper quite famously said, the Acts of the Apostles reads like a thriller. Why should the modern day Acts of the Apostles read like government white paper? There was this real sense that this was a movement, it was a primitive movement. It imagined itself to be a primitive movement, to be reflecting something of what early Christianity was. The second aspect of the imagination is it was built by lots of contemporary stories as well. So the Cross and the Switchblade, widely read by the charismatics who were at that conference in 1971. A book about a Pentecostal minister who ends up in New York, who, you know, the kind of archetypal secular city, if you like, and who is able to witness to, you know, some of the hardest to reach young people in New York. Stories like that and many other stories. You know, charismatics were great writers of books. They were great writers of testimonies. And these stories also constructed the charismatic imagination. And then thirdly, and this is the third aspect of the charismatic imagination, which is very evident at Guildford in 1971, as I've said, was this idea of a new Pentecost, this idea of a climactic resurgence of the church before the return of Christ. And this was very much set, and I suppose this is another aspect of the book, which I suppose is quite important to what I'm trying to say. It was very much set in the context of the long 1960s. You know, this was a turbulent decade worldwide. Nuclear anxieties, a kind of passing away of the old world to the new world. It's interesting the way some charismatics talk about the death of Churchill, for example. This idea of the death of an old leadership, and now we need spirit-filled leadership. Events in Israel and Palestine, widespread concern about secularization, widespread concern about the kind of death of God theology and honest to God theology. And this idea that this needed to be countered with something quite different. And the hope for the world and the hope for the church was a return to the Spirit, a return to the primitive Spirit-filled Christianity. And all that is very evident at the Fountain Trust Conference of 1971.
Yeah. Well, it's just fascinating to hear you talk about it. And what do you think are the sort of key themes that towards the end of the 1970s then are left unresolved, or are the ones that you think are particularly worthy of further consideration? I mean, in a few minutes we'll bring in Felicity Lawson and Bishop John Finney, who are both working on a project that we're doing, seeking to collect some of the institutional memory of Anglican renewal ministries and other renewal movements, I guess, since relatively speaking, when, give or take, when your book ends. But what are the themes that you think are particularly significant towards the end of the period, broadly speaking, that you're looking at?
Yeah, there are lots of, I mean, by the way, I think I'm delighted to hear about this plan for collecting oral histories. And I think it's so important, so timely. And there are a number of, I suppose, kind of loose ends to the book, or kind of trajectories that continue on and that beyond the 1980s, and that at some point could be explored. I mean, I think one important theme is that although the charismatic renewal had always been part of this kind of global nexus, from the 1980s, and I've explored some of this in my work on SOMA, sharing of ministries abroad. You may have come across SOMA. It's increasingly global in its interconnections, and there's a mutuality there as well, in a kind of a global leadership. SOMA, sharing of ministries abroad, which is almost like a kind of global fountain trust for Anglicans in some ways. And there's a lot more I could say about it, but
I should say SOMA remains today a partner organisation of Resource. So I'm sure several people on the call may well be SOMA supporters directly, but that relationship has been one that has endured over many years. So yeah.
Yeah. And SOMA's leadership in the 1980s becomes a global leadership. It's led by Anglican bishops, indigenous bishops from Singapore, from Kenya, from different places, and that's quite a significant shift, I think. And it wouldn't only be evident in SOMA circles; it would be evident in wider charismatic circles as well. I think by the 1980s as well, if you look at the way in which the Fountain Trust closes, I think in 82, I want to say, or 80 even.
I think.
Yeah, around that point, there are a lot of questions being asked about, what is distinctive about the charismatic renewal now? Because in its early days, particularly when it was a kind of quite peripheral movement, and there was quite often hostility towards charismatics. There were a number of charismatics who were turned out of their churches because they spoke in tongues. There are many examples of that. But as it becomes increasingly accepted within the church, some of its kind of distinctive practices and theology seem to become less so. So, at the beginning of the 1960s, how did you know if you were a charismatic? For most people, you'd been baptized in the Spirit, and pretty much the first thing you did as an experience of that was to speak in tongues. At least that's what it said on the tin. That's what was supposed to happen. But I think by 1980, that's quite different. I think things are quite different. Less emphasis on baptism of the Spirit and tongues. And for some leading charismatics who've been there from the beginning, particularly people like Dennis Bennett, that was really problematic. I think in some ways he thought the movement had lost its way there, lost its distinctiveness. I think by 1980 as well, some of the kind of radical ecumenical dynamics of the movement, and it is radical. You know, Kevin Rannican, the leading American Catholic charismatic, used to say that this was the most significant grassroots movement bringing Protestants and Catholics together since the Reformation, and he was right. But I think some of that radical ecumenism has been lost now, and I think that's because as charismatics have become increasingly accepted within their own churches, they have, and quite rightly, you know, I'm sure there are good reasons for forming Anglican organizations and Baptist organizations and Catholic organizations. But I think at the same time, some of that, the radical liquid nature, ecumenical nature of the movement has perhaps been lost. Fourthly, the 1980s sees this eruption. I mean, it's there in the 1970s, but in the 1980s, this erupts of emphasis on apostolic leadership. Apostolic leadership, and you see this in some of the independent apostolic networks which emerge in this decade, but also, you know, a kind of apostolic leadership even evident amongst some charismatics in the mainline churches. This idea of apostles in leadership. And then fifthly, I would say a fifth theme would be one of ethnic diversification. It is striking to me that in the 1960s and the 1970s, in the UK, the charismatic renewal as a movement, as a kind of self-identified movement of people who said, I am part of the charismatic renewal, was largely white and was largely middle class. And there is some irony here, because at the same time, you have Black majority churches, which are Pentecostal, some of which made up of African and Caribbean men and women who had been part of the mainline churches in the Caribbean, who come to the UK, who in many cases find themselves not feeling at home in mainline churches, or in some cases feeling a sense of hostility from mainline churches. And it is noticeable that the charismatic renewal of the 60s and 70s has very little to do with those emerging Black congregations. Now, from the 1980s, that does seem to change. And there does seem to be more interaction between these diverse ethnic, charismatic, Pentecostal holiness churches. So I think that's another key theme, that as you look at the charismatic renewal from 1980 onwards, is one of the trajectories of change.
Thank you. This is all fascinating. I'd love to bring in Felicity Lawson, who's one of our trustees, and also John Finney, Bishop of Pontefract. Now, of course, John and Felicity worked together many years ago, but in a parish which pioneered the Saints Alive course, which, long before Alpha had hit the headlines, was suddenly being done by hundreds of thousands of Christians, and bringing renewal particularly into ordinary Anglican settings, in the period, I suppose, during and immediately after what you're talking about. Felicity and John, I'd just, perhaps first to Felicity, just love to hear your reflections on what you've heard, and what your reflections are at the moment as we begin this project, thinking about the history and what we can learn for the church today.
Well, first of all, to say thank you very much, John, for what you've shared with us. And I'm really excited and looking forward to purchasing this book come January, because I think you've done a task that was really, really needed. John might say more about this, but it was back in March when we realised that other than the sort of testimony sort of books and a few teaching books, there was no overall critical history of this early period, and certainly not one doing the sort of links that you've done. And we were interested in history, yes, for its own sake, but not only for its own sake, but to ask the sort of questions you've left hanging there. What have we lost? What is that the church today might learn from those early years of charismatic renewal? What mistakes were made? We're not very good at learning from history, are we? At least I don't think we are. That somehow or other might be fed in. And so we set up this project really not knowing where we were going with it. But the way that we've been put in touch with so many people makes me think that the Holy Spirit is behind it. And not least that this conversation today is a very, very important part of what we're seeking to do.
I should also mention, as part of all of this, resources going to receive some of the Fountain Trust tapes that had been at St John's, Nottingham, and it was lovely to mention this to you, John. And you say you hadn't known of anywhere where tapes of their meetings still existed.
I think I nearly fell off my chair, Christopher, when you told me that.
Right. And it's nice to know that where the resources that were at Mattersey have now gone, because I knew Mattersey had closed and I knew that a lot of the Fountain Trust documents had gone there, but I had no idea where they'd ended up. So that's great.
John, do you want to come in at this point? John Finney.
Yes, in some ways. Our little project began with David McInnes and myself grumbling together. We experienced all sorts of things in that 60s, 70s period, and we were now passing to our rest fairly quickly. And it was important to gather together some of the material which was being all too easily lost as people's houses were cleared. And there was a need to be able to have some central point where people like yourself, John, historians could draw on material. Further, I think we felt that it was important to begin to analyze that period, to see what were the good points and what from that period still remained. Because looking at the Church of England, certainly that period had a vast impact upon our praying, our worshipping, and our thinking. And you only have to look down a list of bishops to see the numbers who were very much involved in renewal 20 or 30 years ago. So it has had a massive impact already. At the same time, I'm very conscious that some of the mistakes which we made then are being repeated now. And I think certain of the elements which were very much to the fore then, particularly I think the business of personal renewal. We're tending to have a charismatic culture rather than a one by one before the Lord. And I think we're missing out a great deal on the lives of our churches. Felicity and I produce Saints Alive, if you like, to help people into that particular experience. And as she said, it's been very, very widely used, hundreds of thousands of people. But at the same time, we're very conscious that now we're sometimes dealing more with the church than the individual in a rather un-evangelical way. And the other thing I think is that in those days, the ecumenical thing was very, very important indeed. I can remember having a Roman Catholic preacher for the very first time in my church. It would have been unheard of 10 years before, and welcoming and gaining greatly from his ministry. And I think that we have most certainly lost, and I think it's been a very great loss to the whole church. I think the whole question of what do we mean by worship needs to be rethought. Are we
It's one of
rating
the
upon
things you grumble about, John, isn't it? When we say worship, but we mean singing.
Yes, okay, I'll shut up. But what do we actually mean by worship? Is it really resting in the Spirit and waiting upon the Spirit? Or is it something which is very much more organized beforehand? So there are all sorts of other issues which I think I'm fascinated in, and which I think are well worth bringing to the fore and thinking through again.
I think if I can just sort of put a tail end on that, that one of the things we've lost in the worship is the Catholicity of charismatic worship, that the culture of charismatic worship for a lot of people is more a Wimber style of worship, if I can put that way, a block of worship, a block of teaching, a block of ministry. Whereas in the earlier days of renewal, from an Anglican point of view, we still valued liturgy, and we looked to find ways in which the Holy Spirit could move within liturgy. And I think the church has lost something by the easy identification of charismatic with a certain worship style.
And theology, I would say too.
Yeah, too.
Anderson Marsh has just said maybe we've forgotten how to wait on the Spirit, always wanting a quick fix and to move on. Anderson, perhaps we can come back to you in a moment on that, and do use the chat if there's anything you'd like to raise. John Maiden, I wondered if you wanted to say more about is there something about the charismatic movement itself that has meant it's been worried about taking history too seriously, or looking back rather than looking forward?
I'd like to just briefly come back on something Felicity just said there. It was really interesting to me. There was this moment, I mean, you probably both remember it well, that I seem to see this moment at about the mid-1970s where there were parish churches within the Church of England, and not just the ones we all know about, but others as well, where charismatic worship in the whole was being integrated with the liturgy of the church. And I think partly because the Series 3 liturgy did leave some flexibility and spontaneity. So there was this moment, but then, I mean, perhaps it is largely the impact of Wimber and the Wimber model of worship. But by the 1980s, it does seem that increasingly charismatic worship is kind of packaged as its own thing, rather than something that is seriously integrated into the liturgy of the church. I mean, I may be wrong, but certainly some things that I've noticed. But I mean, to come back to Christopher, your question about history, I think there are two things going on here. One is that, and as you and I have said in conversation, that I think very often charismatics are interested in the new thing that the Spirit is doing, and in that sense quite kind of presentist. You know, what is happening right now, but also looking to the future. Where is God leading us? And in many ways, that's probably a great strength of charismatic Christianity as well. It keeps it vital, it keeps it current, and all the rest of it. But I do wonder if that contributes to a kind of neglect of the past. But secondly, I think also there is this kind of schema of Pentecostal charismatic history that is almost kind of, you know, it's the conventional wisdom now, whereas you have these three waves of the Spirit. You know, you have Azusa Street, you have the renewal of the 50s and 60s, then you have the neo-charismatic wave with Wimber and others in the 1980s. And that is so widespread as an understanding of the history of charismatic and Pentecostal movements. It can be difficult to say anything different to that. And I think something that I've really found with this book is that there, you know, we do need to look at these antecedents, even to Pentecostalism, you know, to look at the impact of the healing on the Keswick movement, for example. To look at the impact of people like James Moore Hickson in the Church of England in the 1920s and the 1930s. You know, these are movements, these are individuals with a deep awareness of the presence and power of the Holy Spirit. And so I think there are new things to be said about charismatic history that go beyond that quite kind of formulaic and in some ways restrictive boundary of the three waves.
So Valerie Lowe is on the call. Valerie, do say hello if you'd like to, but Valerie says she was administrator of SOMA from 1986 to 1991. I don't have written material, but I do have lots of memories. Well, I'm sure Felicity and John would be delighted to hear
Absolutely.
Well, Felicity and I certainly used to know each other in the past.
We certainly did.
I mean, Valerie, how does this, you know, how do you receive what you've heard so far today?
Well, I got first sort of met renewal in the mid-70s, transformed my life. My husband was ordained. Sadly, he's died a few years ago now, but we were thrilled by it, and working with Michael Harper in SOMA, and not just in UK, but it did involve meeting the international parts of SOMA, which was very significant, of course, and important. And the realization that we were always told SOMA, sharing of ministries abroad. What is abroad? Everywhere you're not. So there was always that openness to receive from what we might call the third world churches, as well as to minister to them, which was of great significance.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's just fascinating to hear, and we should say Felicity and John remain very open to contributions from people, and there is if you go to the feedback part of the resource website, there's a form you can fill in, or just a way of contributing information, you know, whether Valerie, you or others would like to do that.
Yeah.
John, John Maiden, you've spoken about the significance of examining this history in relation to the mission of the church today.
Yeah, and again, you know, I'm not a theologian, but I do, and you know, my work is it's critical history. I'm a mere historian. That's all I do. But I do attend I do now attend actually an Anglican charismatic church in Manchester.
Got there in the end.
So I do have some interest, personal interest in these things as well. I mean, in terms of mission, I think one thing I find fascinating is how we understand revival and renewal now. Because my reading of charismatic renewal in the 60s and the 70s in this country, but also in other Anglo world countries, is that there is this sense of, are we on the brink of a revival here? We think we probably are. In the 1980s, I think that language of revival, that expectation around revival, is not nowhere near as prominent. And I think that how we think about revival and how comfortable or how uncomfortable charismatic Christians are talking about revival now is very interesting to me. There's a Hillsongs song which has this line that always jumps out at me as a historian, which says, "I see a near revival." Even in that lyric, there's an ambiguity and there's an uncertainty about an unwillingness, it seems, to talk about revival in the largest sense. And I just think that's interesting. I don't really have a comment on that, but I think it is worth keeping in mind as Charismatic Christians think about mission. The other thing that I've noticed in my work on the 60s and the 70s is this almost a kind of perennial tension, and this comes back to something that John mentioned earlier about kind of an insular renewal and outward-looking renewal. There are examples of both in the 60s and 70s. There are examples of a real radical missional activity going on. I mean, the community of the resurrection in Houston, for example. I mean, that all goes, there's a whole kind of backstory to that as well, about where that goes. But in the 1970s, a real radical approach to community living and to engaging local communities. It is not at all insular. But and you see it also at St. Michael the Belfry around the same time, and so much influence going back and forth there. But also these examples of where charismatic community can become very insular and very inward looking. And I do think that's I have friends who were involved in the Toronto blessing and who encountered the very same tension there. They would say there was that very same tension between something that very quickly becomes something that is inward looking and insular, where perhaps there was potential for it to become something quite different. So, as I say, I'm not a theologian, I'm a historian, but I do see that kind of perennial tension there between inward looking and outward looking in spirit-filled movements.
Yeah.
Well, it's fascinating. Obviously, we believe, you first need to be alive in the spirit so that you can then be active in mission and retain hope for that kind of work of God today in its fullness. But I think it is very much one person at a time, isn't it? John, we're very grateful to you, and we'll say another thank you in a few moments. But